week, I thought we could talk about some of the good news. We've talked about some of the things that have been pretty disappointing lately, but there's been some good stuff happening that I just want to celebrate that we're making headway, and it's slow and it's painful, but things are happening. And
It's so encouraging. It's so encouraging to see some good things happening, see some good decisions being made at the legislative levels. And so, yeah, let's talk about that because
yeah.
everybody needs hope. We all
Yeah,
need
we
to
need
know that
hope. We
there's
need to
hope.
know that that we can make a difference. And so um, we have two different types of legislative efforts that have been happening. One of them is the fair play in sports. So basically, this is just saying we want girls to compete against girls and boys to compete against boys. And there have been some victories there. And I don't think any of these have gone all the way through to law, but they've made it through committee hearings and then and to votes. And for those who maybe don't understand how a lot of the state legislative processes work, maybe I'll just sort of generally what happens is a bill goes first to committee, and a committee will debate it, and the committee has to vote to move it to the full House or the full Senate for a vote. What's happening a lot of places, and what happened here in Utah, is that they voted not to move it forward, so they killed it. But in a lot of places, these bills are starting to move into the full Senate or the full House for vote. And so um, I think in most of these cases, it's gone through one branch fully, but it hasn't passed through the other branch fully. But the fact that it's even making that far is really good news. So did that make sense, my explanation?
Yeah, very much so. I
Okay.
feel like I'm really weak in law and weak in understanding how those processes work. So I appreciated that explanation. That was good for me.
Oh, good. So we have here Mississippi, Mississippi State House. So it's gone through the House, and then it still needs to go through the Senate. But it's and the article says ban transgender athletes from girls and women's sports. Is that really what they've done?
No. And that's something that, Aaron, I get so angry when I see some of these headlines because they make these false dichotomies. And false dichotomies are where two options are presented, and those are the only two options.
Mhm.
And that's not what's actually happening. So you'll see this often with like bathroom bills. Oh, trans kids banned from using the bathroom. No, they're not. No one's ever been banned from using the bathroom. No child has ever been prevented from using the bathroom at school. They're just asked to use the bathroom that corresponds to their physiology. So same thing here. No, nobody's being banned from sports. You're being required to compete against your same biological category, which is fair.
And I just wonder, how many people would support these initiatives if they got good reporting about it. So if the media instead said Mississippi State House passes a bill that requires boys to compete against boys and girls to compete against girls in athletics, I suspect most people would be like, well, yeah, why do they need a bill for that?
Right, right. Because when you hear the word trans girl or trans woman, most people are not thinking, oh, that's actually a boy, that's actually a man. They see girl or woman and they think, well, yeah, what's wrong with girls competing against girls? That's great. And this is
Yeah,
part of the obfuscation of the language that's being intentionally perpetrated on people is confusing. Who are we talking about?
right,
We are talking about a boy. When you see the word trans woman, we're talking about a biological man. When you
right.
see the word trans girl, we're talking about a biological boy. And that's what's confusing to people because I think you're right. I think most rational people think, yeah, boys should compete against boys, men should compete against men. Women are smaller, women are not as strong, women are not as fast as men as a category. And I think, wasn't it Coach Blade told us there's on average like a 12%
Right.
difference
A
between men
significant
and women.
difference. Yeah. And I actually interviewed Dr. Tim Roberts not long ago, and he is very pro transgender. He actually fully supports medically transitioning kids. And he did a study, and he even showed that after a year on testosterone blockers and on estrogen, that men still had a significant advantage against women. Even so, so these bills are not saying children can't compete in sports. They're saying if you have a boy who chooses to dress as a girl, he still has to compete against boys. The fact that he dresses against girls doesn't change his biology or his advantage as a male. Um, and and why wouldn't we allow a boy who likes to be more feminine compete in sports? Of course we would. Of course we are okay with having tomboys tomboys compete in sports. We want children to compete in sports. So these headlines are really misleading and disingenuous.
Well, somebody asked today in a group that I'm in, are there any girls who identify as boys, so girls who want to dress as boys, trying to compete in boys' sports? We don't really hear about that. And I think we don't really hear about that because most biological girls are not going to be competitive enough to make the team on a boys' team. When I was in high school, I tried out for sports. I'm not particularly athletic. I wasn't good enough to make the girls' team most of the time. And so if I dress as a boy and try out on the boys' team, I'm going to be even further behind. I'm not going to make the boys' team. But when a boy who's only sort of mediocre playing against boys wants to dress as a girl and try out for the girls' team, he's going to have a much higher likelihood of success.
Yeah, and I think that somebody explained this to me, and I'm like you, I was not particularly athletic, but what she was telling me is that if you have a 10-year-old who's really good at sports, it's not unreasonable for them to compete against 11 or 12 or 13-year-olds. But you don't go the other way. So you don't have a 10-year-old competing against, 8, 5, 4-year-olds, because of the advantage, and that goes with weight classes too. If you have someone who's, I guess in some certain sports like wrestling, they have weight classes. So if you have somebody who's 140 pounds and they want to compete against someone who's 180 pounds, typically we wouldn't have a problem with that. But if you have someone who's 180 pounds, they're not allowed to compete against someone who's 140 pounds because they have an advantage. And that's how it was explained to me, is that you look at the person who has the advantage and you don't allow them to compete against those who have a disadvantage against them.
And that's why organizations like Save Women's Sports, Beth Stelzer's organization, is working so hard to keep men out of women's sports to preserve that fairness, because there's a reason that women compete against women. And I've made the analogy, and I don't know if this is a good analogy or not. I would need someone more athletic to tell me, but to me, that's like putting a horse in a greyhound race. Like, greyhounds can race against each other, but if you throw a thoroughbred in there, the thoroughbred's going to beat all the greyhounds.
Yeah.
And to me, that's like putting a man in women's sports.
Well, and that's what we're seeing, is that these records that have been held by women are just being smashed when biological males compete as women. And of course, I mean, and so one of the things that was frustrating, we actually had this kind of legislation here in Utah, and legislators voted it down. And the rationale for voting it down was, well, there really isn't this much of a problem. If one or two males decide to compete in women's sports, it's really not that big of a deal. It's just one or two people. You guys are blowing this up. It's not that big deal. But if you have a girl and she loses her scholarship because a male is competing against her, that is a big deal. And the reason that we set up women's sports is because we wanted girls to have some opportunities. Let me see. There's another one. We have another bill. Let's see. That one was Mississippi. I do have another headline on Mississippi, and of course it's Fox News, and it says Mississippi passes transgender ban in girls' sports. And so even Fox, which has a reputation of being,
And Fox is in favor of boys compete against boys, girls compete against girls, and they still did.
I know. I'm just like,
Nobody's banned. Nobody's banned.
Nobody's banned. And I just want to say that over and over and over again.
Men are banned from women's sports.
Right.
But nobody's banned from sports.
Nobody's banned from sports. Right. Yeah. Exactly. And somebody who's 200 pounds is banned from competing against somebody who's 100 pounds. Somebody who's 25 is banned against competing in junior league sports. I mean, so we do have certain bans, but generally that person is not banned from competing. They're just told they have to compete in the sports categories in which they fit. And we do have other categories in which people fit. If we start smashing this one category, then are all the other categories going to be smashed? As you know, a 200-pound guy says he identifies as 100-pound. I mean,
Yeah, I don't know why we
why?
wouldn't.
Yeah, why we wouldn't? So we have this other headline. This is Wisconsin bill seeks to ban transgender athletes. And again, that's
It's
not
like
what's
they're all sharing one brain, right?
Yeah.
Are all of these journalists sharing one brain? Because they're all writing the same thing.
Yeah,
And it's not
it's bizarre.
accurate.
Yeah, it's completely wrong. And it's so frustrating because again, I think if people really understood, then they wouldn't think that this is being fueled by a bunch of radical bigots. They would be like, well, of course. And so we have
I have a question
Uh-huh.
about, I just happened to think of this. You know, in advertising, advertisers are bound to the truth.
Yeah.
They can imply things that aren't true, but they can't actually say things that aren't true. And I'm
Right.
thinking about that old Oil of Olay commercial that they had. If we say it makes you look 10 years younger, it does.
Mhm.
If we say it reduces lines, it does. Every phrase is preceded with if, so they never actually say it. So they didn't get in trouble. If they said this makes you 10 years younger, they can get in trouble for that. There's truth in advertising. Why isn't there that in journalism? Why are
Yeah.
journalists allowed to say transgender athletes banned from sports?
Yeah.
Because that's not
It's
accurate.
not true. It's not at all true. Yeah. And it's as you said, there should be some we should expect it. There should be some expectation that they're reporting accurately. And I'm frustrated by that. We have some other kinds of legislation that have gone through. Alabama has done what Utah was trying to do, and a number of other states have tried to do, and it looks like Alabama is actually going to do it. And this is the Vulnerable Child Protection Act, which is basically saying this is not an anti-transgender bill. Let me read again the headlines. This is more typical of the headlines that I'm seeing about what's happening in Alabama, which is lawmakers revive bill targeting medical care for trans kids. So the narrative is that these laws are denying medical care to children because they're transgender. And that's just not true.
No, yeah, the language that they use frames things a certain way. And we really need to get more savvy with reading something and asking, what is this saying?
Yeah.
And is that accurate?
Yeah.
Because I think we've trusted the media for so long, and justifiably, you know, I think in the past, the media has tried to be fair and be just and be accurate. And we've just lost that. And we've got to catch up, and we've got to start reading these headlines and asking ourselves, is this really what's happening?
Really true? Are we in a society where there are actually people who are passing legislation that will ban children from getting health care? No. So what this is doing is it's banning experimental medical procedures that have been completely unproven to be beneficial to children who have gender dysphoria. In fact, we have studies that show that they're harmful. So these legislative efforts are much like the efforts to ban vaping for children, to ban tanning salons, tattoos, these kind of cosmetic surgeries, other kinds of cosmetic surgeries. We tend to protect our children because we know that they're not cognitively able to make long-term decisions that are in their best interest. And so to me, the fact that they're calling this medical care even is shocking. This is not medical care. This is quackery. There's no evidence to suggest this is in any way helpful. And we have lots of evidence to show it's harmful.
So why would somebody want to medicalize children? Why is somebody trying to do this? Money.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and I was talking to someone just today about this, and a lot of people don't understand this. If you medicalize a kid, if you put them on puberty blockers and then wrong sex hormones, even if they decide to go off them, if they've been on them long enough, that kid is medicalized for the rest of their life. My friend Billy Burley went through a full medical transition, and he has to take testosterone shots for the rest of his life. Um, Girls who go through this and have hysterectomies, if they decide to detransition, they have to take estrogen for the rest of their lives. Otherwise, they're going to have tremendously negative consequences. I mean, the body needs those hormones.
So let me just clarify. So what you're saying is when a child decides to transition to the other sex, if they stay transitioned, they're going to need to take those wrong sex hormones for the rest of their lives. If they change their mind and want to go back to living as their birth sex, if they've been on the transition hormones long enough, they're going to have to be on their own, what their body would want, whether that's testosterone or estrogen. They're going to be taking hormones for the rest of their lives.
Either way, big pharma wins.
Either way, big pharma wins.
Right.
Yep.
The kid loses because either way, they're not going to be as healthy and their body's not going to be as functional as it would have been if they had not had those interventions. So,
Oh, Erin, we started this video wanting to be positive and hopeful and tell people about all this great stuff. And we just keep going to this is horrible, this is horrible.
Yeah, and again, I want to say that it's very exciting that Alabama they're this close. It's gone through the Senate, it's gone through both committees, and it looks like it's going to pass. So Alabama is going to be a state where kids are going to be protected, and that's really good news. And the other state,
an influx of people moving to Alabama.
Yeah, I know.
As I talk to parents, and you probably see the same thing, as we talk to parents who are going through this with their kids, they're looking for like, where can I go that my kid's going to be safe?
Yeah.
Or is there any place in the nation? And Alabama might be the first place that we can say, if you want your kid to be safe for medicalization, move to Alabama.
There you go. Yep. And Montana, I believe it's Montana, is getting closer to passing a bill that bans surgeries on minors. And so these are unnecessary mastectomies. These are boys being castrated or even having their penises removed, amputated. And what's interesting to me is that they chose just to take on the surgeries in this bill. And they're still getting pushback, even though every single trans activist I've ever talked to says, oh, they don't do that to children. Well, if they don't do that to children, then what's the problem with this particular bill? Why is it that it got so much pushback? Why is it that so many people went to testify against it if this doesn't happen to children? Well, we know it does happen to children. And that's another thing that the activists say is this never happens to children. You're just making that up. Well, I've talked to detransitioners who've had their breasts removed as minors. I've talked to doctors who have fully supported boys being castrated as young as 15. Johanna Olson-Kennedy actually suggests that children should have these procedures when, before they're of the age of majority, before they're really able to give medical consent, because it just will make them so much happier. So again, you can't have it both ways. You can't say this never happens and then be opposed to a bill to make sure that it never happens.
Right. I hear that all the time too. I've had so many people tell me this never happens. Yeah. Minors are not having mastectomies. and I've asked, how many links do you want me to give you? How many pictures do you need?
Yeah.
And I don't get any response.
Right. And it's so frustrating because when you're fighting against people who are willing to just blatantly lie, who have media basically lying, it's really hard to get the truth out there. So the last headline I wanted to look at, it says, state anti-transgender bills represent a coordinated attack. And one of the things that I've seen lately is the hashtag by the Human Rights Campaign, which they're not, the Human Rights Campaign sounds like a wonderful organization, doesn't it? Human rights.
Yeah,
No,
they're not about human rights.
No, they're not about human rights.
They're not about women's rights. They're not about children's rights. No. They're only about trans rights.
Yeah, they're really advocates for big pharma. That's basically what they are. And they have a lot of funding. These organizations have so much funding. And they've been circulating the hashtag this week, let kids play. Because again, they're promulgating the myth that we're somehow segregating certain kids and telling them they're not allowed to play in athletics. And they did this with the bathroom bills too, that somehow, like you mentioned, that they're these poor people who aren't allowed to use public restrooms, which just isn't the case.
Right. Right.
So there is good news. Yeah, I know it's hard because I feel like, this is just, it's such a behemoth. The media's bought into it, and people just don't have the information. But the fact that there are some legislative efforts that are being successful gives me hope. I really believe that when people start to understand what's happening, more of these legislative efforts will go into effect.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I've been encouraged too, just anecdotally online, how many more people I see questioning this,
Mhm.
expressing concerns and pushing back.
Mhm.
A year ago, if I posted something on Facebook or Twitter that was at all questioning or negative about the transgender agenda, I just got piled on
Yeah.
by the trans rights activists.
Yeah.
And I'm not having that happen as much. As soon as I start getting slammed by people, other people are stepping up and
Right.
stepping in, and I've been really encouraged by that. We're not as lonely as we were a year ago.
Right. And I think that that's what's really important is that we're starting to connect. People are realizing that if they don't stand up, children are going to be hurt. And hopefully people are starting to realize that they have a moral imperative to protect these kids. That's our job as adults. Our job is to make sure that kids are not led astray, are not harmed. And in this case, these kids are being actively harmed by medicalization. So it really, as you are too, I'm seeing more of that, more people who are like, maybe last year were like, I'm not getting involved, this isn't my business, who are starting to say, hey, wait a minute, this isn't okay, we need to stop this, we need to stand up to it. And so if you're one of those people who want to connect, I encourage you to come to our website, partnersforethicalcare.com. We have a way for people to submit stories. So if you've been someone who's been hurt by the transgender agenda and want to share your story, if you're a parent whose child has bought into this cult, if you're a teacher who's really concerned about what's going on, just anybody who's had experience with this, we'd love to hear your stories. We're trying to document them because, again, we get this never happens. And so we're trying to document, yes, it does. This really does happen.
Yeah, yeah. Please come to our website and keep watching our videos and stand up for children.